Hello, this is Rick Jordan. I'm the Church Resources Coordinator for Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina, and I want to welcome you to this webinar. Today's webinar is on clergy spouse health, and our presenter is Scottie Stamper. Scottie is an ordained minister, a board-certified chaplain, an educator, a coach, and claims to be the most enthusiastic spectator at any Broadway show. She completed her doctorate in educational leadership from UNC-C in 2016, and her dissertation topic was Clergy Spouse Well-Being. So we got the right person for this webinar. Scottie is the Director of Education and Organizational Development for Iredell Health System in Statesville. She has several coaching clients, 3 piano students, and is also a volunteer chaplain for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Today's presentation will begin with Scottie's presentation, and if you have questions or comments you would like to make, you can scroll to the bottom of your screen, and where it says Q&A, click there, and you can type in your question or comment. And when there is a natural break in the presentation, I'll present those to Scottie, or if there are things that look like she's going to address that I know, we'll put them at the end. But feel free to put the question or comment in the box at any time. I want to thank you for your joining us on this webinar, and just a reminder that it is being recorded and will be stored in the virtual resource library on the CBF of North Carolina website, cbfnc.org. Scottie, welcome, and before you begin your official presentation, I guess, tell us how you became interested in this subject.
Sure. So I was a church minister for about 10 years and then left church ministry in 2004 to become a chaplain. And when I left church ministry and went into chaplaincy residency at Carolina's Health System, now Atrium, I realized the stressors that I had had on me as a minister, and didn't realize it in the minute of it or in the time of it, but it was amazing to understand better the stressors that ministers are under. I lost 100 pounds right out of, as I left church ministry and moved into chaplaincy. I lost about 100 pounds doing CPE at Carolina's healthcare system, and really became interested in well-being as individuals and how we look at that differently in the church than in the hospital, for example. What does well-being look like? So then in 2010, I had the opportunity to become a wellness advocate for the United Methodist Church as they were going through, it was called the Clergy Health Initiative, and it was sponsored by Duke University's Divinity. It was a 6-year study based on clergy well-being, and had the opportunity to coach pastors, coach families on how to set boundaries, how to establish themselves in a community, but have those boundaries as well to better work towards their personal well-being. So then, after that, I decided who's working with clergy spouses. And so this was my dissertation topic for my UNC-C double studies. Just became a huge passion for me, for not only for clergy spouses, but for clergy spouse and families. So we are ready to begin when you are.
All right, I'm ready. Yeah, take it off.
All right, so we will begin here. I have a question for those of you who are with me. I would like to know, and if you can tell me your setting. Are you in a rural setting or in an urban setting? And tell me about the size of your church and how long you've been there. And then maybe how many miles between your church and your home.
And I think to do that, the easiest way to do that would be to scroll to the bottom of your screen, and where it says chat, you can click on chat and type in your answers. And another screen will pop up. There we go. We have someone responding now.
About 175 folks on Sunday. Church is 20 miles. That's great. Super. Thank you, Luann. Anyone else? That makes a difference in how clergy and clergy spouses are treated in their community. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Very urban, okay, on Sundays, 10 or 15 minutes from church. So no one's right on the campus of their church so far. Thank you, Meg. I appreciate your response. A lot of the work that I did with clergy spouses, I'm going to move my chat over to here so you can still see what's going on there. A lot of the spouses that I worked with, of course, were with the United Methodist, and in a lot of those cases, they lived on the church campus, which makes a big difference as well. Let me ask you this. Oops. Here. How does this feel familiar in any way? Oh, both ministries. Awesome. 25 minutes from both. Good deal. Thank you, Abby. How often does this feel familiar? And the reason I put this up here is to think about the stressors that you go through as both clergy and clergy spouse. You have the financial, excuse me, the financial stressors, the work responsibilities, hectic schedules. As I remember being a minister and thinking, where am I going next? There were so many places to be in, often at the same time. This is a big one, is the lack of boundaries often in church settings, interruptions in study, loneliness and isolation, the lack of authentic friends. How do you find those in church settings? Some unrealistic expectations of your congregants. You're maybe married to a spouse, but you're also married to the church in some ways. And how about those congregational watchdogs? And then we have the fishbowl kind of living as well. Did those sound familiar? You can use your chat box for this as well. Absolutely. That's so true. It does. It feels, all of those things kind of showed up in my research, and it's things that I didn't think about as a minister necessarily, but for the spouses, it really came true, especially the isolation and fishbowl living that you live in. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit too. Where am I going next? Sounds very familiar. Great. Let's see what this says. It's fairly good with boundaries. Good. Steph, or less good with not over-functioning, which seems to affect all of our families more than anyone is aware. Exactly. So part of what we want to talk about towards the end is what are some interventions that we can incorporate in order to make sure that those boundaries are set, that we are being able to live authentic lives so that your lives are meaningful and are purposeful. So my model for well-being came from, in seminary, believe it or not, I taught aerobics. They had aerobics at Southern Seminary back in the 1900s. And this became my model for well-being. Early on, I didn't realize I was going to go into well-being the way that I have, but it really certainly created a model for me to follow. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and other people. So if we look at this, if you look at the wisdom there, he grew intellectually, he grew physically through the stature. In favor with God, he grew spiritually, and he grew with other people. So he grew socially as well. So think about it, how that growth happened emotionally as well. So when we think about well-being, we're not just talking about health as in physical health. We're talking about well-being in all kinds of ways, in intellect and in physical and in spiritually and socially as well. Oh, there's the reference. So well-being incorporates who we are, first of all, intellectually. So one of the questions I often end up coaching about is how are you creating, learning new skills? Can anybody talk about how you're stimulated intellectually in your current setting? Finding hobbies that are important for you, maybe in your own work. Can you ask that again? Sure, I can ask that again. What are you doing to stimulate your own intellect? What are you reading? What's on your current reading list? What new skills are you? Thank God for NPR. That is great. That's fantastic. Exactly. And I'm with y'all. I believe that too. One of the things that we think about too about the intellect aspect of it is how do we keep from. I can remember I served on staff at Providence Baptist Church with Bo Prosser. Okay, thank you, Rick. I appreciate that. I think about the cynicism that can grow inside a staff that becomes really close. I worked at Providence Baptist Church with Bo Prosser and learned a lot about being real with my emotions and that kind of thing in the moment. So being able to talk intellectually about how things are moving along without being cynical and be real with that. How would you describe yourself as a lifelong learner? That's an important part of the intellectual growth that happens, or the intellectual well-being piece of this, is how are you continually learning without it being the new math of your children or spelling words from your children or anything like that, but it's your own intellectual processes. How are you growing? How are you taking care of yourself physically? Are you eating nutritionally? Are you exercise days a week? This became a big issue for the United Methodist pastors as they were in, especially those of you in rural communities. Where do you go to work out? Is there a gym close by? Does your church have a family life center? And when you go there, are you able to be a church member as opposed to the clergy spouse? That's a very important piece that we found out, that especially in the rural areas, it's harder to find that physical outlet to be a part of. Are you generally free from illness? And are you avoiding alcohol and over the counter medications as well as prescribed medications? One of the things that I often think about is, are you reasonably proportioned height and weight? And spiritually, what are you doing? This is an enormous piece for both clergy and clergy spouses. How do you, as a church pastor, as a church clergy spouse, how are you growing spiritually? Do you take time out to meditate? Do you pray regularly? Is there a sense of serenity that you practice, or a place that you're able to go to think spiritually? Because when all of these things begin to crash down on us, we begin to act out in ways that are unhealthy for us. And so these aspects are really, all right, let me look here. I've got a couple of notes here. The hardest one for me, good yoga and fairly healthy, but nurturing the spiritual life. So, and some of us do battle chronic illness, so can't avoid meds, exactly, but work to reduce them. So working with a physician. Working with physician is really important in these aspects, and making sure that all of those, sorry, I'm going to move this, making sure that, you've got a physician who is an advocate for you, not an advocate for the pharmaceutical companies. As I've worked in healthcare, I've seen so many physicians prescribing because they have a connection to pharmaceutical reps, and that's just, it's a big danger. That's part of, you've got the opioid crisis that we've got currently is because they were over medicating or over prescribing opioids. So it's wonderful when you have a physician who is an advocate for you. I'm gonna keep this chat box. I'm sorry to keep doing this. And do you have meaning and purpose in your life? Finding that meaning and purpose. One of the things that I often, when I coach clergy spouses, is to think about who are you connected to spiritually. Often when it's your spouse, it's hard. Who is your pastor? And if you're a pastor, who is your pastor? Who do you go to for your spiritual well-being? And I think that's a great opportunity. And Rick, you may want to speak more to this at some point, but how is CBF with your group, the church resources? You're an awesome outlet for folks who are not, who don't have their own pastors. So being able to reach out to you and to those church resources, maybe there's a database of good church resources as well. There's also the, I think it's the CBF Coach Network that's out there and available for coaching. So there's lots of opportunities for all kinds of resources there as well. How about socially? This is the one I think that got me the most as a minister, was having people, my friends, that I could be as honest as I am with my family. How do you have authentic relationships in a church? Is anyone fortunate to have those in your setting? And if you are, consider yourself very lucky. That often happens, or it doesn't happen often is what I meant to say. It's often difficult to build those relationships because they don't see you as a person. They see you as the spouse of their pastor. And that's hard to build relationships when they can't see you as who you are, and what you bring to the table without being attached to your spouse. So being able to label your feelings and being able to talk with people in a way that makes sense, and not feeling isolated. Sometimes as ministers and clergy spouses, there's a feeling of isolation. There's that fishbowl again, and your children as well, having that those not good set of boundaries to be able to have those friends. Children are dealing with this too. They're often, how many of you know about preachers' kids? And they're preachers' spouses' kids too. And so being able to talk about those things too with people. Sorry. Oops. Emotionally, some of the questions I have about emotional well-being is, do you have a sense of humor and do you laugh often? Are you able to label your feelings and you're able to express your feelings appropriately? As a hospice chaplain, I would deal with folks who were very angry, and they would say, I can't be angry at God. And I would say, well, God created anger, so why can we not express emotion as well? If we believe that God created everything. So have another chat and see. Good. Oh, good. So Beth said that she, the folks at her church she got Valentine's Day cards. That's wonderful. That is neat. And hopefully a lot of you are in churches that are very supportive of you as human beings, not as the clergy spouse. Finally, let's talk about the occupational and financial aspects of being clergy spouse and being well-being. Being able to set clear boundaries with the time you spend with your friends. And one of the things that I found in my studies, in my work, in my research, is that it was hard for clergy spouses who lived close by their church to actually find work. So I'm not sure if that's true for those of you who are with me today, but that's often a piece that gets clogged up for pastors. The next thing I want to talk about are the different layers of our lives. And this is where we kind of dig in quite a bit to the differences for clergy and clergy spouses and clergy family. There are 5 layers, and this is taken from McElroy's model for health, for good health, for well-being. We have five layers. So first of all, we've got the intrapersonal, the self-concept. How are you dealing with your own your personal well-being? Do you feel like you are bringing something to the table? Do you feel like you are living your own life? Or our pastor's spouse, wife, life? It makes a big difference in how you view your own personal, or your goals, your life goals, and your achievement being recognized. That's the first part. Clergy spouses often feel as though they're treated differently than other congregants. So are you experiencing that? And if so, then how do you get out of that? And we'll talk a little bit about some of the boundary setting there again, is being able to live your life. And often this happens not even in clergy spouse relationships, but in spousal relationships. This also, I've learned, happens with physicians and physician spouses. Many times they feel like they're having to live the life that the physician in the family is living. They go to all their parties, but not to the spouse's parties, for example. Intrapersonal, so that's the self-concept, your own attitudes, your own beliefs. Do you have the same belief system as your spouse? And how does that affect the relationship? Oops, that went too far. Interpersonal is your social network, your family and your friends. Are you able to be real with your family and your friends and the people who live in your immediate, that you talk to every day? Those are your interpersonal relationships. And how are they? So when we think about your intrapersonal and your interpersonal, are you feeling good about the relationships that you have with other people who are close to you? Institutional. So the institutional are formal rules of your current location, of your current congregation, and thinking about what are the formal rules about when your spouse went through the interview process to become the pastor of the church, did he or she have to answer the question, what does your spouse do? When I went through my job interview for the director of education at Iredell Health, no one asked me whether I was married, that's illegal in most settings. So it's really interesting that in churches, we kind of cross that boundary of asking what does your spouse do? What are your children like? Some of those things that are totally off the paper when you're in what I call real life. That's of course not real life. The other thing I would think about are what are the informal rules and standards that happen in your church. Those are as real, if not more real, than the formal rules and questions and standards of your church. Finally, in your community, thinking about what is your neighborhood. And if you're living in a rural community, how many people from your congregation live close to you? How many people see you in the grocery store every day? How many people see you, you attend school, or your children attend school together, and so you show up at PTA meetings? They're watching what you're putting in your grocery basket. Opportunities for employment, all of those pieces fit into this aspect. Finally, in policy, I like to talk about this one quite a bit because so in healthcare, we talk about best practice. And one thing I've realized is that in church work, we don't talk about best practice. We don't talk about how churches are how can we standardize church policy in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, in whatever denomination we're in, how can we begin to, and I know we're priesthood of the believer and the autonomy of the church, but there's got to be some kind of, there should be some kinds of standards, even if it's personnel, if there are best practices to begin to incorporate, so that we focus on the well-being of our clergy. One of the things in clergy spouses, one of the things that I often think about is, as clergy spouses, how are you modeling for the congregants what well-being is? So when you have authentic relationships, when you get angry and express that appropriately, that's great modeling for the congregants in your church. So being able, when you and your spouse are arguing, to be able to talk about that in a way that makes sense, and then to debrief those things if you need to with each other, to talk about, we're modeling for you what good relationships are about, is going through tough times and then coming out on the other end with some kind of resolution. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Scottie, we don't have any questions on the board yet. I've got a question just on what you just said. With modeling, when you said that, then I thought, well, yeah, that's true. We should model all these good characteristics. Mm-hmm. But doesn't that also keep the pressure on that this has got to be the perfect couple? Like now they model.
No, I would go totally against that, thinking that the what is authentic is what we should model. So, in thinking about, to be able to express, I'm struggling in an open environment, and to be able to say, I'm so mad at, and I wouldn't make it like I'm not saying to make it out in the open kinds of things, but when the opportunity arises, to talk about the struggles that you have as spouses and as a married couple, to model that and to talk about when, to tell the stories of when things have been rough. It does model for them. Having those boundaries when you or your spouse are asked to be at meetings every day of the night, and you've got meetings Monday night, you've got meetings Tuesday night. Where do you set up those boundaries and say, no, this is, I'm not going to be there because, in fact, how many of you have something going on tonight that's not related to your spouse, that's church related? This is a time for, this is a Valentine's. I actually celebrate Singles Awareness Day, which is sad. But anyway, that's another story. So, but being able to model for them what good boundaries are, I think that's more of the piece that I really like to focus on, is what are your boundaries. Does that help, Rick?
Yeah, that is helpful. I think saying being authentic gets it across rather than, and you didn't use the word perfection, but there's so much pressure that you as the minister are perfect, your spouse needs to be perfect, your children needs to be perfect. And so to kind of get away from that perfection and be authentic, I think is a really good word.
Absolutely. And it comes with educating your community of faith. It doesn't happen overnight, especially if you've been in a community of faith where the seven most deadly words of a church are, we've never done it like that before. And so if you've been raised or if you are in a church that has been raised, I guess you could say, to believe that pastors and pastors' wives or pastors' spouses, I'm sorry about that. That was bad of me to say that, but the clergy and clergy spouses, that if you live this perfect life, then that's what they expect, then they're going to always expect that. One of my favorite quotes, and I use it with my educators, I use it with my team at work, I use it with my coaching clients, is that you promote what you permit. Say it again. You promote what you permit. So how do we begin to promote things that are healthy, promote lifestyles that are authentic? It's important that we think about what that looks like as compared to this perfection that many of us think is the way to go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we do have a question that's come.
Okay.
This is I'll read the question to you. I'm a minister, not a spouse, but I'm trying to find ways to support my partner. The church is very supportive of me, but he often feels either too visible, like the fishbowl, or invisible, not recognized and cared for by the church as I am. Are there specific practices you would suggest to those of us who are clergy about how to help our partners cope and how to help our congregations relate to them as humans?
And great question. That's a wonderful question. So being able to not be invisible and not to be too visible. So yeah. Sometimes I think about what is can I ask the involvement of this spouse in the church?
Or it's not a partner, not a spouse, but I'm assuming, a very much beloved one.
Sure, absolutely.
So we're waiting for that answer if she wants to respond to that.
Okay.
Their participation in the church. Okay.
I think it's important to think about the person's involvement and what they want to, how much they want to be involved. And one thing I would recommend that a spouse not be incredibly active on decision making, like significant decision making groups, because that can often get kind of I don't know what the word might be, muddy, I guess would be the word, to think about how that gets kind of muddy when there's too much power given to the spouse clergy, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you wouldn't want your spouse on the personnel committee?
Correct. And that, I think about that in terms of the institutional piece. That the personnel committee is a super example of power and how those change, how that changes with every new person that comes on. So a personnel committee is made up of maybe 4, 5, 6 people, depending on the size of your church. Every one of them comes in with a new idea about how their personnel, maybe from their workplace or their previous church or whatever, that they come in with an idea about what personnel standards should be. And so that's one of the things I think about in terms of policy. Where can CBF write, and maybe you have, is write, here are best practices for standards of personnel. It makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think we do have some things on personnel policies, and we have some things on sabbatical policies, and several types of things about policies that someone could look up. But if you have other resources, we would be glad to put them in our resource library. And for anyone who's participating as well, if you have any resources that you think would be helpful for others, just email those to me and we'll look at them and put them on. We did get a response to your question about this. She says, he was a newish member when I arrived as a new minister, and we met and began dating with the blessing of the congregation. This was a little over a year ago.
Wow. So there are lots of new things in that whole scenario. So you've got a new church member, starts dating a pastor, who's also, sounds like that's fairly new too. So there's lots of, I think one of the things I like to do is think about what it looks like from 30,000 feet. What does that bumping into look like? It sounds like there's a lot of moving parts in that scenario. So one of the things that I would encourage is, sounds like you may be getting to know each other still in that process. much long you've been married or how long you've been together, but that whole process of learning one another and then learning the folks in your community of faith as well. And I don't know if you're in a rural community or an urban community, but that also makes a big difference in how visible or how invisible a person is.
Mm-hmm. And there is that constant tension in there between, like, there is visibility, and especially in probably a smaller congregation. I think someone had maybe a large congregation. If you've got like hundreds and hundreds of people, it's more possible, it seems to me, for the minister's spouse or partner to blend in.
Yeah.
And, you know, the church I attend is pretty big. If the minister's spouse is not there, nobody says anything about it because there's so many other people around. But other churches I've been in then that are smaller, if the minister's spouse isn't there, it's like, well, why aren't they coming? You know, what's
Right.
And so there is that thing of the fishbowl, or I like your picture of the safari with the lions around you.
That's right. And that's the scenario where the pastor's spouse is expected to teach a Sunday school class, is expected to run the youth group, or is expected to play the piano. That's, you know, those are stereotypes from the 1950s and the 1940s that still linger in a lot of congregations, believe it or not. And it's, so yeah, so that safari can feel like that, or it can feel like you're out in the ocean on a raft somewhere, you know, all by yourself as well. So
this is not a question from anyone else again, but just a question that comes to my mind.
Okay.
Is that, like, as you've just said, there were models from the 50s, say, and maybe the 60s is what changed things. But now, so many couples, both of them are professional and working, and so it's like the expectation is just totally unrealistic. If your spouse is working professionally and needs to work out of town on the weekends or whatever, to expect that the model is going to be the same. And I think it's also hard if you follow someone who they lived the 50s model and now you're coming in and the church may have the same expectation.
And I believe that too. And thinking about, again, how are you educating your congregants to understand the model, to understand the model of well-being? And again, this comes in with teaching about well-being. What are their boundaries? Why are they so concerned about your life? What is it that's distracting them from their own life that they have to be concerned about yours so much? That's often a question that I raise when I'm talking with congregations, is what is it that makes their life so much more interesting than yours? And it's more about, this is the way we've always done it, as opposed to this is a better way of doing it.
Do you think there's almost like it seems like there's almost like a, when you just said that, what came to my mind was the fascination that we, even as Americans, have with the monarchy in Great Britain.
Yes.
That, you know, it's like we will never get to know those people, but we know so much about those people.
Exactly. Or even our own stars and folks who live, you know, I think about the fascination with Big Brother. I don't watch any of that. I don't watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, but just our fascination with other people's lives, and how does that affect our own living of our own lives? And so that's something I think about as a minister, is how can I help people understand that their own lives are so much more interesting than the lives of people they're watching. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, God created us in God's image. So why have we reduced ourselves to looking at somebody else's life for that power, for that understanding of who we are?
So how do we What we have, I mean, I know you can create policies, but policies are voted on in the business meeting with one person over the quorum to be able to do that, and it's not necessarily going to change the culture.
Right.
Do you have some suggestions for culture shifting the ideals or expectations of clergy spouse?
I do. I think again, I'm going to go back to the education piece and having those one-to-one conversations about, especially with people who tend to disagree with the way a clergy spouse is. So I think about, I had one of the clergy spouses that I interviewed for my dissertation happened to be one of my youth in a former youth group. And she was telling me that in her church, they lived on the campus of the church, and the ladies of the church would come, some of the ladies in the church would come in on Saturdays and use her oven for events that were happening at the church.
Mm.
And it was just an interesting thing. And so one of the things that I coached her through was to have conversations with those folks and ask them to put themselves in her space. And so really it begins with one-to-one conversations around people with whom you disagree, which is so hard anyway, but being able to walk into a conflictual context, not conflict, that sounds, but a one in which you disagree with someone or they don't understand, you don't feel like they understand, to have a one-to-one conversation with those people. And then that context and culture begins to change over time. It doesn't happen with a sermon. It doesn't happen with policy. You're absolutely right. It comes with relationship building and helping them understand your life as you understand their life. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
It's hard. It's really, really hard. And you have to go in and be able to not take preconceived ideas about what that looks like, what the outcome's going to be, but to have just heart-to-heart conversations with them and say, I'm not going to please you all the time, but you need to understand where I'm coming from as a clergy spouse, that I'm human too, and that I have feelings and that I have a job, that my life is as valuable as my spouse's life, my spouse's life, who happens to be the pastor.
Mm-hmm. All right. Are there other questions or comments that our viewers would like to ask or comment on?
Let me just speak to this for just a minute. One of the things that I often talk about in just conversations that I have is it's easy for us to, and we can have these conversations with people who may not understand our lives. We can explain to people how we are, why we do the things we do, or we can ask them to explore it with us. So to use that explain versus explore dichotomy, they can explain to us why they feel the way they are, but to ask people to explore more about their own uncomfortableness with their own person. I think about, there was a person in my church when I was a youth minister who used to complain to the pastor instead of coming to me. That's one thing. That's a whole different ballgame. But who would complain to the pastor that, now I was a youth minister, and the high school was directly across the street from the church, and she would stop by the church at lunchtime, and she would complain to the pastor, Scottie's always eating lunch over at the high school. And I mean, she had a problem with that. But I was eating with the teenagers who were, and it was the one time that we could meet and have a 30-minute conversation and it not be too, there were other people around, so it was a safe place for them. It was just really interesting that she would say, gosh, Scottie spends all this time with teenagers. So then begin to ask her, what is it about that bothers you, and help me understand your perception of what's happening there. And it begins to dig into the layers of their own lives about how maybe they didn't feel that they were getting the that they needed. So it begins to open up all kinds of conversations when you ask the questions as opposed to explaining it. Did I make that clear? I hope I did.
Well, I think that's a really interesting, I like the phrase itself, explain versus explore. So like you're saying, like this situation that you just gave, you could spend all day giving the youth ministry philosophy of why you're over there talking to them. But they could just maybe brush that off. But if you challenge them to explore why this is important to them.
Exactly. And for clergy spouses, the same thing. Why do you think I need to be here all the time? What is it about? How will that increase your belief that we're okay? Or how will that increase your belief that the pastor is the right person for this position? Does that make sense? So to really help them explore why that's such an important aspect of their relationship with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. That's not my own. That was through CPE work, so.
Well, none of us are our own thoughts anyway. So.
Exactly. That's my thoughts too. So.
I'll just tell people, Scottie said that people said yes.
Bye, Meg. Thank you so much.
So I know you've got some resources you want to share with us on some slides, and we'll also put those in a document with our webinar.
You had a question up there. Is there a question that just came across?
Let's see. Oh, that's someone saying they had to leave also.
Okay, great. So these are some of the resources that I used. I'm sorry, there it is. Some of these are great resources. I'll send these to Rick so that they'll be in a Word document for you. But you'll see here that some of these, the paradox of children and clergy families, these are all pretty, can be pretty heady research articles, but when you get into the real discussion of them and that kind of thing, they are fantastic. It's just a great resource. This is where I began the ecological model of human development. This is where I began to do the research on the 5 layers that we live in. We have that intrapersonal, interpersonal, then our institutional, community, and policy. There's Bronfenbrenner goes on and talks about how even in, not just for clergy spouses, but for every person, how many different layers we all live in. We live in this ecological model of human development, which was fascinating. Oh, okay. And then we'll get to this other one. Here's some other great resources. McElroy is the one who wrote more towards health promotion using Bronfenbrenner's model. And then finally, I wanted to speak a little bit about the Presch-Hobel, excuse me, I'm sorry, Regine Presch-Hobel was the principal researcher along with David Toole at Duke University. They are both researchers at Duke University. David Toole is in the Divinity School. Regine was in population health. That they are the ones who are the principal investigators for the Clergy Health Initiative. One of the things that fascinated me when I began my work with Duke University is that of the United Methodist pastors in North Carolina, 98% were either obese or 78% were either obese or overweight. And compared to 61% of the regular population, just normal population. So there was such a huge increase. And I asked Regine, I said, have you done any studies about Baptist in North Carolina? And she said there's not a lot of work that has been done with Baptists because there are so many Baptists. I mean, brands of this. We've got Southern Baptist, CBF, we've got Alliance, we've got all kinds of different Baptists. But in the data that she was able to show me is that Baptists have even higher levels of obesity and overweightness than United Methodists do, and they were at 78%. So you can imagine what that kind of looks like. So Ray Jean has some wonderful data to look through, and as I said, I'll give these to Rick. So, any other questions? Well, I am grateful for your time and your participation. And Rick, thank you for this opportunity. It was a great pleasure to prepare for it and to present it. So.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for joining us, everyone. And Scottie, thank you especially for your study of this and presentation of it. And we'll look forward to getting more of the resources and putting them out there so we can follow up.
Super. Thank you again.
Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.